Thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to give it another 60 seconds or so before we get started, just to let everyone trickle in. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today for another Old Ways webinar. Today's topic is whole grains for growing minds, nourishing the next generation. And we are bringing this topic to you today because today is International Whole Grains Day. So this is part of a larger effort worldwide to help people meet their recommended whole grain intake. So yeah, it's perfect timing, I think. So our disclosures, no commercial support or funding was provided for this webinar. And before I get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes. Yes, we are recording this session. You will receive an email with the slides, the CPEU certificate, and the video recording within a week. Honestly, probably by the end of the week, but within 1 week for sure. So keep an eye on your inboxes for an email from Old Ways. We will have time for Q&A at the end. So if you think of any questions, go ahead and type them into that Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll get through as many as we're able. And then, of course, please visit our website. We hope to be announcing more of our webinars for the coming year soon. So today I am joined by two wonderful speakers. Dr. Juliana Cohen is an adjunct professor of nutrition at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and professor and director at the Center for Health Inclusion, Research and Practice at Merrimack College. Her research has included a focus on children's nutrition and also the National School Lunch Program. And our other speaker today is the wonderful Sharon Palmer, the Plant-Powered Dietitian. She is a registered dietitian and cookbook author with more than 20 years of experience in the field, and she holds a master's in sustainable food systems. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Dr. Cohen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to be talking with you all today. Yeah. So today I'll be really focusing on the role of whole grains within the context of school meals. And so today we'll be talking about some of the benefits of whole grains that are specific to the context of a school setting, then thinking about different opportunities to provide more whole grains in a school context, but in ways that students will actually eat them. And I'll be sharing a lot of my research, which really highlights the acceptability of whole grains in a school context. The first thing that I would like to note is that I do not have any conflicts of interest. My research that I will be sharing with you today has been funded by the Healthy Eating Research, which is part of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, as well as through funding from the National Institutes of Health. So the first thing that I'd like to share is really thinking about specifically the benefits of whole grains in the school context. And oftentimes when I'm speaking with schools, we talk about benefits of whole grains, or we think about the health benefits, but what's particularly interesting is in the context of schools, what they're really interested in is how does this impact academic performance? And in fact, there's really strong connections between healthier foods like whole grains and academic outcomes. So when we think about, well, why is this the case? There's actually a number of ways in which whole grains can be improving children's academic outcomes. The first is that whole grains have a lower glycemic index compared with refined grains. And this really promotes blood sugar levels as well as satiety, as well as executive functioning. Well, what is executive functioning? This is higher level cognitive functioning that's associated with things like impulse control, things like working memory, a lot of what we think about in terms of success in the classroom. And satiety is something that's really important as well, because, even I know personally, when I'm hungry, I have a really hard time concentrating. And so whole grains can help promote satiety among children as well. Additionally, the B vitamins that are in whole grains are actually cofactors for the enzymes that synthesize neurotransmitters, which also improves cognition. And then specifically, folate impacts myelin sheath integrity and nerve cell membranes, which also affect neuron function. So to kind of more succinctly kind of describe the benefits of whole grains. These foods, a healthier diet, especially whole grains, can lead to meaningful changes in a child's brain structure and function, particularly in the frontal cortex region. So this is the area highlighted here in the image that I have. And this is through synapse formation, neurogenesis, myelination, and glucose control. So a lot of really important benefits around whole grains when we think about children's physical and cognitive growth. Some other benefits of whole grains in the school context are, first, it really complements nutrition education. What the research shows consistently is how important nutrition education is, but that it has to be complemented by changes to the broader environment. One of the trickiest things is when we go into schools, for example, we teach about healthier diets, but then if they're going into the cafeteria and there aren't those same healthier options, it undoes some of the benefits of nutrition education. Now, with the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act, which has really strengthened the opportunities for healthier foods in schools over the past decades, this really is a nice complement to those educational opportunities. Additionally, peer modeling plays a really important role. So when other children see their peers eating these healthier foods like whole grains, this makes a big difference. I can tell you, having an elementary school student and a middle school student, they are heavily influenced by their peers. They eat school lunches every single day and are more likely to be eating the foods that are similar to what their friends are eating. And really importantly is that schools provide an opportunity for students to try new foods, such as whole grains. So for example, if this is something that they're not typically eating at home, this is a really important opportunity for students to be exposed to these healthier foods like whole grains. As many of you have probably heard, there's really good research about the number of exposures students need before they like a new food, and this can be 10 or more tries. This can be particularly challenging for families, especially those from lower income households that may not have the resources to be able to have all these exposures, especially if they're concerned that their child may not eat it. With school, this is a low risk environment for students to have those repeated exposures. And research shows that outside of school, if a student, for example, asks the parent, says, "Hey, I tried something at school and I really liked it. Can you buy it?" Parents are much more likely to purchase it, especially those from low-income households where now the risk is reduced, where they have limited resources. So schools can be a really important opportunity to be exposing students to whole grains. But then, of course, the big picture question is, will students eat whole grains at schools? Foods are only healthy if a kid actually eats them. So will kids eat whole grains at school? Yes, and our research has consistently showed that students will eat the whole grain items at school. So the first thing that I'd like to present you with is some of our research looking at when the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act was first implemented. And one of the requirements of this legislation is that schools had to start providing more whole grains. At the time, they had to provide at least half of grains were whole. Prior to that, they were not required to serve whole grains. And when we went into schools, very few were serving whole grains. So the data that I'd like to show you here, on the left, we have selection of entrees, and on the right, we have consumption of entrees. The light color is before the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, when almost no grains were whole grain in the entree. The dark brown is after the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act was passed. And this is where the majority of grains are now whole grain in those entrees. So starting on the left for selection, what you can see is that there's no change in selection. Once the entrees became whole grain, just as many kids were selecting them. What's also really interesting and important about this research is that we actually track the exact same kids over time. So this was with a detailed plate waste study where we measured the exact percentage of every food consumed on these children's trays with parent and child permission. So we were actually tracking the exact same child before this law was passed and then after the law was passed. So what was really encouraging is that we saw kids were just as likely to select an entree that was whole grain compared to when it was refined grain. Interestingly, when we looked at consumption, we actually found an increase in consumption of the meals. So we found that on average, students were eating about 15% more of their entree when it was whole grain compared to when it was a refined grain. So additionally, when we think about what works in schools, what are the policies and initiatives that we can do to support whole grains? The first is to really highlight that these strong nutrition standards work. Currently, they're considering increasing the requirements for whole grains at the national level for the National School Lunch Program. And what our research and the research of others strongly supports is that this is a really effective strategy to get kids to select and eat more whole grains. Whole grains become the new norm for foods. Additionally, a lot of our research has focused on really the palatability and the cultural appropriateness of school meals. Oftentimes with school meals, there's a lot of pushback about concerns about food waste. The reality is that kids eat just as much of healthy meals as they do of meals, before we updated the school meal standards. Instead, we really need to focus on how do we make the foods even better tasting, and this can be through more opportunities to scratch cook, seasonings, and also thinking about the specific student populations. So what are the recipes that can be developed that might be kind of a whole grain twist on things that are familiar to them that they're eating at home, for example. And this can be something that where schools can be working with families, they can be doing surveys with parents, students, etc. And complementary to this is for the schools to do taste tests with these whole grain recipes. So they can get feedback from students to say, I like this, but it'd be even better if you could have like hot sauce on the table. So this would be a little bit more familiar. It's something more similar to what I like. Or actually there's this really nice seasoning that like my family likes to use. It'd be so much better if it was this way, for example. Or for them to say, we love this. That's really encouraging for a school to then be able to really put that on the menu. This next one is probably no surprise, particularly to any parent out there, but whenever we provide choices, so it's not that we just have one whole grain option each day, it's that they can choose between a dish with brown rice or a dish that maybe has whole wheat bread or a dish that has quinoa in it, for example. When we give kids options, then one, they often feel more ownership over their selection, and they're more likely to consume it. This is really the same, outside of whole grains, we see this with fruits, we see this with vegetables, etc. So this is really good, just common practice where possible. And then also what we have been doing a lot of work on is working with culinary experts and chefs. And so, for example, in Massachusetts, the John C. Stalker Institute has free training programs that can be online or in person. And they give schools a number of different kind of culinary trainings that they can select from that may better align with their student populations and really be able to think about the self-efficacy, the confidence that their staff will have to be able to prepare scratch cooked meals with more whole grains, for example. What I'd like to very briefly show you is some of our results that look at the impact of when you do these culinary trainings with chefs. And again, the focus is on the sustainability of these programs. So it's providing staff with existing skills that they can continue on. And this probably won't surprise a lot of people that when we collaborate with chefs, we see selection of whole grains significantly increase and their consumption significantly increase as well. Just by small modifications to improve their palatability and the cultural appropriateness for student bodies. Some additional policies and initiatives that I would like to highlight that I think are just general good practices as well. One of the things that we really like to focus on is that whole grains are something that are really nourishing for children and adults as well. And really focusing on that these can be really appetizing foods as well. And the reason why I say like not healthy in quotes is because oftentimes different people have different perceptions of what healthy is. And it's actually really interesting, some of the research that when we call things healthy, it actually creates a halo effect. And they actually end up overeating later in the day because they feel like they've eaten healthy earlier. Or oftentimes, and this is some really interesting research, is it changes people's perception of the palatability of the food, even by calling it healthy. So instead, we really try and stay away from that type of phrasing and instead use a lot of the same strategies that a traditional restaurant would use in terms of how they highlight foods, for example, like power bowls or Italian style pasta with fresh vegetables, things like that, where we're not necessarily highlighting that it's healthy. Oftentimes we don't even mention even the phrase whole grain. These are just foods the same way we don't highlight that spaghetti is refined grain. This is just an Italian style pasta and the acceptability is really high. The other things that I'd like to highlight are strong school wellness policies more broadly that really complement the opportunities for students to consume whole grains. And this actually translates to healthier foods in general. So again, it is associated with increased not only whole grain consumption, but also increased milk consumption, increased fruit consumption, and increased vegetable consumption. And so these policies, which we have extensive research looking at, include one, sufficient time for students to eat. Many of you may not realize that in the United States, we do not have any policy around the amount of time students have to eat lunch. So I actually will go into Boston Public Schools, for example, with a stopwatch with my research team. And these are schools that have 15-minute lunch periods. And what many people don't realize is that this includes the amount of time it takes to walk to the cafeteria, wait in a lunch line, and then sit down to eat. We have tracked kids with as little as 3 minutes to eat their lunch. And I know, unfortunately, even in my own children's school, my daughter in middle school, sometimes teachers will delay how long it takes for a student to get to the lunch period as punishment if students aren't listening, et cetera, and they'll actually hold the class. And there's been times where my daughter has said that she has skipped lunch because she didn't have enough time to wait on the lunch line, for example. So strong wellness policies that mandate a minimum of 20 minutes of seated time, which is often through a 30-minute lunch period, depending on the size of the school and how many students are receiving school meals. Another policy specifically for elementary schools is to have recess before lunch. So what we find is that when students have recess first, it gives them an opportunity to run around and work up an appetite. which is great. They come into the lunchroom calm and hungry. So this is a really great opportunity, again, to further promote whole grain consumption. And then lastly, limited access to competitive foods. Competitive foods are the snacks that are sold on the lunch line and in vending machines, ice creams, for example, beverages as well, sold in vending machines. These are the foods that compete with the school meal program, that are sold during school hours, but outside of the school meal program itself. And what our research consistently shows is that when students have access to these competitive foods, one, they often replace that with a school meal. So they'll purchase a competitive food instead of a school meal. Or if they purchase a competitive food and a school meal, they eat less of their whole grains, their fruits, vegetables, and milk as well. And then not surprisingly similar to this is closed campus policies. Again, this is primarily at the high school level, where possible, having schools that don't enable students to go off campus, where the options are much more likely to be refined grains, for example, compared with the healthier options that we have in schools. Really quickly, what I want to share with you is the impact of when students have less time to eat. And the dark green bar is when students have at least 25-minute lunch periods. And then the lightest green is where students have less than 20 minutes to eat. And what I really like to highlight is that students eat significantly less of their meals, including their whole grain entrees, significantly less of their vegetables, significantly less of their milk when they have less time to eat. And what this bar graph doesn't actually highlight is the fact that they're even less likely to even take a fruit when they have shorter lunch periods as well. So this really highlights the importance of a sufficient time for students to eat their meal so that they truly can eat those healthier whole grain items that they have. So in conclusion, I would really like to highlight that whole grain consumption really supports both healthy physical and cognitive development in children. This is a win-win policy when we have more whole grains in schools for both parents, children, and for educators. And school meals are an ideal opportunity for students to be exposed to these whole grain items, especially when they may not be exposed to it at home. And there's some research supportive strategies that are evidence-based and consistently work in schools that can really encourage students to consume the whole grains in schools. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just gonna share my screen here. Okay. That was so interesting, Juliana. I'm excited to talk about powering up kids' diets with whole grains as well. And I wanted to start with having technical. Here we go. Here are my disclosures. And I just wanted to start with showing a picture of my own son, Nicholas, who's now 25. I was always, as a dietitian mom, I was always trying to get my kids to eat whole grains and loved cooking with them. And to this day, they love whole grains and they love to cook. And no doubt that that batter that my son is licking the wooden spoon of had 50% whole grains, if not more. And I also wanted to share this image of an oat baby muffin recipe that's on my blog at sharonpalmer.com. And it's really highlighting that even for infants, when we're starting the baby-led weaning or we're starting the self-feeding, these soft muffins that are made with oat flour, no added sugar, are a great entryway into eating whole grains. So I'm going to be sharing a lot of my recipe ideas with you, and you're more than welcome to use those in your work, educating about whole grains. So why whole grains in kids' diets? And Juliana really shared a lot of great information about cognition and development. And when we talk about whole grains in kids' diets, I like to really mention that, a lot of times fruits and veggies get all of the attention. We're always trying to get kids to eat more fruits and veggies, which is of course important, but whole grains are also important. They're nutrient dense. They're, packed with nutrients that are important for growth and development. And research shows that kids who get more whole grains in their diets have better diet quality, overall nutrient-rich diet quality. And this leads to better satiety. We know that whole grains with that fiber content, kids are feeling more full and satisfied with their food. And I also just want to give a shout out to how sustainable whole grains are. They're one of the most sustainable food groups we have. So by increasing this consumption in kids' diets, we can help reduce the impact of our food system on the planet. So just a little refresher on whole grain nutrition. When we're talking about whole grains, we're talking about grains that include all three of the parts. The outer bran, which is so rich in fiber and B vitamins, iron, copper, zinc, magnesium, and phytochemicals. And then the inner germ, that's where we find the B vitamins, the vitamin E, more phytochemicals, healthy fats. And then the endosperm, which is the starchy carbohydrate. It also has some protein and vitamins. But when we're talking about refined grains, we're talking about that endosperm. So that starchy endosperm without the benefits of the bran and the germ. One of the exciting things about whole grain intake among children is that there are benefits down the road. We know that makes sense. As kids establish these healthy eating behaviors, of course, we would expect them to have reduced risks of chronic diseases later in life. But it's really exciting to find out that kids get benefits now when they're consuming whole grains. Research is showing that kids are starting chronic disease development in the first decade of life, such as atherosclerosis. Kids can have type 2 diabetes, hypertension early on. So by increasing the whole grain intake now, they are having immediate benefits. And this has been seen in weight, healthy weight levels, type 2 diabetes, later on, a reduced risk of cancer, certain types of cancer. Even now, better biomarkers of cardiovascular health, such as triglycerides and cholesterol, and also later on down the road, digestive issues for kids right now, better control of issues like constipation, and then later on in life, and even a reduced risk of asthma. So we're not only helping kids later, but we're helping them right now. One of the key benefits of eating more whole grains for kids is the effect on helping them with obesity. About 1 in 5 kids in the US is affected by obesity, and this is defined by the CDC growth chart. It disproportionately affects disadvantaged children. And when kids grapple with obesity, it can be associated with increased physical and psychological health problems, greater risk of health conditions down the road. Also, even during childhood, as I mentioned, lipidemia, type 2 diabetes, hypertension. So the new AAP guidelines that came out in 2023 really are focusing on putting behavior and lifestyle at the forefront for helping kids with obesity. One study called the Change Study found that children who consumed more than 1.5 servings of whole grains per day had a 40% lower risk of being obese compared with kids who consume less than a serving a day. So there is research showing specifically on the whole grain benefits for healthy weight for children. And the researchers are looking at possible effects such as hormonal factors, again, that satiety value when we talk about consuming whole grains, and then the effects on digestion and absorption of carbohydrates. And this could be really the mechanism of action under those benefits for kids. So how many grains should kids be eating? This is from the dietary guidelines. And since 2005, the dietary guidelines have been telling all people, including children, to at least half of their grains in their whole grain form. So on average, for the population, that would be 3 servings, 3-ounce grain equivalents per day. And in the most recent iteration of the dietary guidelines, there was a greater emphasis on children's nutrition. So it's really interesting to see what's going to happen more with kids' recommendations. The benchmark whole grain standard is 1.5 ounce grain equivalents, so 1.5 servings per 1,000 calories. So that's how you come up with an average 2,000 calorie diet. It would be three ounce or 3 whole grain servings. And you can see this chart that's taken from My Plate, where it really breaks it down to the age levels. So you can find this easily on myplate.gov if you're looking for a resource. So a serving, a 1 ounce equivalent would be like a slice of bread or a whole grain or a corn tortilla, a cup of ready-to-eat cereal, a half a cup of cooked grains like rice, pasta, or cereal or grains. And also a serving is 16 grams of whole grain ingredients. So those are some of the serving and the measurements that you see out there when we talk about what are whole grains and how much should we be getting. So it's really interesting to see how kids are doing. And we just learned all this great information on school nutrition. And I wanted to share a little bit more about that because the research shows that kids are the only population group that are actually increasing their intake of whole grains. Now, if you look at these charts on the right, the purple is older adults. They are actually consuming the most whole grains of any other demographic group. So in terms of age groups, older adults are consuming the most, but children are the only group that are actually increasing their intake. And this is absolutely coinciding with school nutrition programs. Starting in 2012, when it was started to be required to regularly include whole grain rich foods, you saw this increase go up. So on the top chart, you can see that whole grains became significantly more rich in school nutrition, school foods after 2012. You see this dramatic intake increase of whole grain foods in the school nutrition program. And that coincides with the chart on the bottom where you see kids' intake of whole grains starting rising around 2012 and continually going up there. So that's really encouraging that the school nutrition program could have such success with whole grain intake for kids. So the current program requires at least 80% of the grains offered in the school lunch and breakfast programs to be whole grain rich. So the criteria for whole grain rich is that the product must contain at least 50% whole grains. So when you kind of do the math, that works out to be about 40% whole grains in the school lunch program. It's still not enough whole grains, though. We're still not meeting our mark for whole grains. And this chart really captures the whole US population, age 1 and older. So it's not teasing out just kids, but you can see in the chart, the blue bars are the areas that we need to shift upward. We're not meeting our goals. The light purple bars are the ones we're consuming more of. And you can see whole grains looks like it's just about the lowest, the biggest target that we have for shifting. We have a lot of room for improvement for increasing our whole grain consumption for our whole population, including children. So what about how kids are doing with whole grain intake around the world? And I thought this was a really interesting study in Denmark, where they looked at whole grain intake in several countries around the world, and they concluded that most of the world's children are not getting enough whole grains. And you can see that this chart that most of the countries were below the recommendation, and they used the US recommendation of 32 grams of whole grain per day, which would be 2 servings. And you can see that Denmark exceeded that. Now, it's interesting because Denmark is part of the traditional Nordic diet, and they have a big push to preserve the whole grain intake as part of the traditional Nordic diet in Denmark. And there are a lot of traditional breads, dark rye breads that are whole grain, that are part of the everyday diet. So it's really encouraging to see that they've preserved that tradition, and kids are eating so many whole grains in Denmark. But if you look at the US, we're really falling short. It's less than half the recommendation, about 14 grams of whole grains, which is less than half. And you can see many countries are really doing poorly with the whole grain intake for children. So the researchers in this study found that increased whole grain intake among 8 to 11-year-olds was linked with better insulin levels, fat mass, LDL, blood pressure. So they found these benefits, but despite the benefits, the intakes were low in many of these countries. They also identified some areas of opportunity. They found that if the sensory appeal was increased for whole grains, so again, making whole grains sound delicious, taste delicious, be very appealing to kids, that could make a big impact. Other things like reduce cost, making sure that the whole grain products were not that much more expensive or more approachable, affordable for families, and to use a familiarization period. So when you're working with kids, if you slowly increase the whole grain so they become familiar with them, like for example, when you're making a pizza crust, use 50% whole grains to gradually familiarize them with these whole grains. That was useful as well. And they also found that if there was better communication and labeling so that families and parents could identify these whole grains, that would be a benefit. So these are all things I think that we can apply to our work, trying to promote more whole grain consumption for children. There is another interesting study in the University of Florida that found that most parents aren't feeding their kids whole grains because they are assuming their children won't eat them or like them. But the researchers found that when they provided these foods, favorite kids' foods, such as macaroni and cheese, snack foods, popcorn, oats, and breads, when they provided these foods in whole grain form, the kids were just as likely to eat them in their whole grain form as they were in their refined form. So that was really interesting, showing, again, we've just been talking about this, that if you offer children whole grains, they will eat them and they will like them. So another thing I wanted to point out is that kids are eating a lot of their whole grains in cereals and hot cereals. So 1/3 of kids' whole grains is coming from cereals. So I think that's a really exciting entry point that we can think about, is capturing all of that cereal and making sure it's whole grain. So I wanted to share some of my favorite strategies to boost whole grains in kids' diets. One thing we could do is swap the pasta, and that was what they did in the University of Florida study. They looked at macaroni and cheese. So pasta is a favorite among children, and you can easily use whole grain pasta. So that is just an easy way. Kids love different pasta dishes, whether it's mac and cheese or spaghetti. So that's one easy thing. Kicking up the sides beyond white rice. Kids love all different crunchy, nutty whole grain side dishes, such as brown rice, red rice, farro, quinoa, sorghum. So thinking about all those side dishes and making sure that they are whole grain. Bake and switch. So when we talk about including more whole grain flours in our baked goods, it could start with half whole grain flour. You could use white whole wheat flour, which is a little more approachable, a little more accepted. Even other alternative grain flours like quinoa flour or sorghum flour, start getting those whole grains in all the baked goods like bars and cookies and treats. Cereal, I just mentioned cereal, but really selling kids on the whole grain cereals. There are so many delicious products out there for children that are whole grain. So really getting them in the whole grain train there. Let kids help with dinner. I'm a huge advocate for helping kids learn to cook. It's very important throughout their whole life. And research consistently shows when kids cook, they have better eating and healthy behaviors. They are more interested in trying healthy foods. They want to try the foods that they've prepared. So whole grains could be part of that cooking lesson for kids. And when you're working with your communities, you can help provide cooking classes for kids. I did that in my community with my children in their schools, offered free cooking classes as a dietitian in the community. And this is one way we can really move this action for children. Try new foods more than once. We've been talking about the power of offering these foods, having them visible, having them normalized in the diets. So being patient with kids, letting them try these foods, having that exposure time and time again can really make an impact. Breads are another entry point for kids for whole grains. Breads are very popular among children, and they can easily be whole grain. It can just be the default whole grain bread. So whether it's sandwiches, pita bread, a flat bread, crisp bread, they can be whole grain. Using fun food and shapes, this has been found to be successful. So when we think about, for example, pasta comes in fun shapes. You can cut sandwiches into fun shapes, but making those foods interesting and appealing for kids can also be successful. And then looking for whole grain foods on labels. And I wanted to highlight the Old Ways Whole Grains Council whole grain stamps as a really great way for parents and families to identify whole grains in food products. Because again, a lot of these food products can help kids meet their whole grain goals. Things like crackers are another very popular food among children. So those could be whole grain as well as the breads and the cereals. So looking for these whole grain stamps, you can see the different variety of whole grain stamps, the 100% whole grain, the 50% whole grain, or the stamp that identifies whole grain ingredients. So that can be a really helpful teaching tool for your children, for your communities as well. I also wanted to share this really great program that Old Ways Whole Grains Council has, and it's this whole grain train song. It's a really great thing for education for children, especially young children. And you can download it here. I've included the URL. You can find the MP3 of the music with the chorus, the verses, the instrumental accompaniment. And it could just be a really fun exercise and activity if you're doing education for children. And it really is a fun song, an interactive song that talks about getting on the whole grain train. So that's a resource for your education. And also check out Old Ways for other whole grain recipes that are kid-friendly and resources. And you're welcome to look at my site at sharonpalmer.com too and grab any whole grain kid-friendly recipes that might work for your education too. And I wanted to share, I have my references here if you're interested in looking any of those up. And I wanted to thank you.
Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. This has been really great, and I think we've all learned so much. Just as a quick reminder for all of our viewers tuning in, we are recording this session, so we'll send you the recording, the slides from the presenters, as well as your CPU certificate within 1 week. And with that, I think I'm happy to begin diving in. So feel free, if you still have some lingering questions, go ahead and add them to that Q&A feature in Zoom. Starting off with a question for Dr. Cohen, what do you think was the mechanism for increased consumption of whole grains in the school study?
So I think there's a few things happening. One is that I think many schools perceived that to provide whole grains that were going to be palatable, I think they really actually put a lot more into the recipe development for these recipes. I think oftentimes people just assume that kids will eat refined grains, whereas because of concerns, which may or may not be unfounded, thinking about providing whole grains and ensuring the kids will actually eat them, I think there was a lot more emphasis on seasonings, on scratch cooking to make them more palatable, etc., which I really think is just a best practice when we think about foods in general. But I think that more attention now is being paid to ensure the palatability of these whole grains. And I think partly, as Sharon really highlighted, I think there's a lot of just misperceptions around kids and whole grains. And talking to a lot of kids, we actually find that they often say they wish the school meals were actually healthier. So I think that there's actually a lot of acceptability around whole grains with children, especially when they're cooked in appetizing ways.
Thanks. Let's see. Oh, you both have had children go through the school system, and I know you're both very in tune with what's happening in that space. So question for you both, are you finding that schools are serving whole grain pasta, whole grain rolls, brown rice? Like, are some of those categories more common than others, or what are you seeing? Maybe Dr. Cohen, do you want to share first?
Absolutely. I spend a lot of time in schools all across the United States. I actually was just in Anchorage, Alaska 2 weeks ago in their schools looking at what they're serving. And it's across the board. We see whole grain rolls, we see whole grain pasta, we see quinoa in schools. Brown rice is really popular, especially as like sauteed or fried rice, things like that. There's just so many recipes that schools are using to incorporate them. The pizzas now have whole grain crust to them. The sandwiches are whole grain bread. So we're really seeing schools really very quickly adapting to increasing whole grains in schools in a way that is really palatable and I think really acceptable to students.
Sharon, is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Juliana said. And I think it's also exciting to see the traditional cultural elements of whole grains too, because a lot of our favorite, there are many cultural traditional recipes that include whole grains, and that there's more of a recognition of these global foodways too. So I agree. There are a lot of it really exciting, easy entryways that are delicious, acceptable, and kids are interested in trying these.
Sharon, do you have any tips for serving whole wheat pasta to kids? Tips for maybe a parent who's tried it and their kid wasn't sold on the taste or texture at the first try?
I have found that a lot of the whole grain pastas, I prefer them a little on the al dente side. If they get overcooked, they get, the texture may not be as appealing, and then rinsing them after they're cooked. And then a flavorful, fun sauce that's a kid favorite, tomato-based sauces. Even a butternut squash sauce is trending right now with the fall holidays. And then familiar, like for the study that found mac and cheese was a really great entryway. So, even like pasta salads can be very popular among children.
And to add to what Sharon said, one thing that, I'll even just share personally is sometimes it's just trying different brands. Sometimes my kids really love one brand of pasta and they're out that day and I buy a different one, and the acceptability is totally different. And so if currently they're not enjoying it, there's a lot of options out there. It's really exciting to see all the different options that we now have in supermarkets. And so especially to not be discouraged if a child doesn't like certain one or even a different shape. So for example, my kids have very weirdly strong opinions about the shape of their pasta, even as a middle school student. And so trying different whole grain pasta shapes can be another great technique as well. And I definitely agree, Sharon, with the pasta sauces, and my kids are particularly loving butternut squash sauce at the moment.
Yeah, and I can speak to that from a food service background too. We found that some of the smaller shapes, like a penne, were less prone to breakage, serving them in a food service setting versus spaghetti. It was sometimes a little bit harder to keep the string in one piece. So that could be another thing to think about too for those of you in that food service area. Dr. Cohen, did you see any economic impacts of switching to whole grains? Any changes, increase or decrease in costs of ingredients or cost savings due to less food waste?
I think that's a really important question, because when we think about the feasibility of being able to serve whole grain items, oftentimes they are slightly more expensive than their fine grain counterparts. But and these are a couple of very important buts. The first is that actually when we're serving the whole grains, we're actually seeing increases in participation, which brings in increases in revenues, which can help offset those small increased costs of the whole grains. Additionally, because of these policy changes that we're seeing at the federal level, it actually influences the market. And as a result, there's more whole grain products now, which are now available at relatively lower prices. I think we do have a broader issue of inflation right now with the price of school meals, but this is impacting all areas of school meals, unfortunately, and not specific to whole grains. One thing that the USDA has been doing has been providing more funding towards school meals, and I think it's really important for them to continue to support and expand and provide additional funds to ensure that schools can be continuing to support these healthier options, including the whole grains.
Great. And on that note, Sharon, do you have tips for parents or administrators who want to bring whole grains to kids but are concerned about cost? Like, is there a more affordable entry point?
Yeah, I know that the affordability is a huge issue, and I do think that especially in food service school lunch programs and among families as well. So I think when we're talking more about using some of these approachable methods, brown rice, for example, as a side dish, using the breads, the cereals, the pasta, these more affordable. I think there's a lot of cachet with some of the alternative products that might be a little more pricey, but some of these humble foods that have been part of our diet for so long, cornmeal, these are really beloved foods that have a more accessible entry point when we think about budget. So getting back to some of the basics and understanding that it doesn't always have to be the fancy, new high trendy food trends that we're seeing,
That's great. Let's see. We have some questions about, incorporating whole grain foods across different levels of food processing. There's whole grain options that are more highly processed, some that are slightly less processed. Do you want to comment on how parents or school administrators or dietitians can help caregivers weigh out those benefits and what they should be looking for? Maybe Sharon, do you want to go?
Yeah, I saw some questions about that. It's a huge issue right now. I think you were talking about some of the questions about processing and processed foods and things. And I think cereals really is an area that might apply to, because I mentioned how cereals are one of the most popular way for kids to get whole grains. So there's been a lot of discussion about processed foods and families putting cereals, some of these foods that actually are nutrient dense into that bucket. And it's been really hard to categorize processing of foods, even though we have a classification system. It's really difficult to do that in a practical way. So I think there's more and more dietitians that are trying to educate their families, their communities, that these foods like cereals, breads, crackers can fit into a healthy diet. They can provide important nutrients. So in my mind, nutrient density is the issue. If these products are affordable, accessible, can help clients, and they're nutrient dense, then we can help them understand that they're not too highly processed, that they can be part of the kids' diets, and especially when we talk about accessibility and how busy families, like breakfast cereal is such a nutrient dense, convenient way. It's a carrier of other healthy things. We know that when kids eat breakfast cereal, they're more likely to have fruit with it and milk or plant-based milk with it. So these are foods that I think we can feel better about, and helping our families understand this whole conversation around processed foods.
And I think that Sharon is really spot on. And as she also mentioned earlier, it can be kind of pathways to increase exposures, maybe to those slightly less processed foods. And again, thinking about it as a spectrum where all these options are better in general than the more refined options, and to really understand that many parents are so strapped for time. Oftentimes there's the frustration as a parent where I make something and then my kids don't eat it. So thinking about opportunities even to combine different grains, whether it's maybe the slightly more processed whole wheat pastry flour, but then combining that with like a lower sugar scone, which has like whole grain oats in it, things like that. These can be nice opportunities to kind of continue exposing children as well.
And we had some nice comments come in from people working in schools who are sharing that they serve things like whole grain pasta, brown rice, whole grain pizza, rolls, breads, and granolas and tortillas. And they point out that in their specific facility, they aim to serve grain items in which at least 50% of the grain is whole. And so you are able to really mimic that taste and texture that kids are after if you need to rely on a little bit of, all-purpose flour for the volume that you're looking for. And I think
I'd just like to very quickly thank all the food service directors and cafeteria staff, because I genuinely believe you have one of the hardest jobs in America, which is you're basically a restaurant for the world's pickiest eaters. And so just really want to emphasize just how grateful we are for the incredible hard work that you're doing. And just so grateful for all the whole grains and other healthy foods that you're giving to children. So just want to particularly say thank you to those who are on the call.
Yeah, it is so inspiring to see. I remember interviewing someone who was working with food corps. And so as a young adult going into schools doing nutrition education. And I was like, oh, what are they eating? Like, what are they enjoying? He was describing this like wheat berry salad. And I was like, oh, wow, like that's really nice for a child, like, very sophisticated sounding lunch, but they loved it. So it's been really neat. We did have a question, and I'm happy to comment on this myself about defining what constitutes a whole grain. And I think that conversation sort of depends on if we're looking at the school lunch program or if we're talking about whole grains more broadly. So at Old Ways and the Old Ways Whole Grains Council, of course, when we talk about a whole grain, we're talking about a grain that has all of its original brand germ and endosperm. And so that can be a whole piece, like a kernel of brown rice, or it could be ground up into smaller pieces, like a 100% whole wheat flour. For school lunch, the rules are a little bit different. They use the terminology whole grain rich. And whole grain rich, as Sharon alluded to in her presentation, means that at least half the grains must be whole. So when the policies were put out that people needed to serve 100% whole grain rich, I think there were some people who weren't as familiar with the policy who said 100%, that's a ton, what are we doing? Without realizing that actually 100% whole grain rich only means 50% whole grain. So Sharon, I appreciate you including that slide in your presentation. And let's see. Dr. Cohen, do you have suggestions for ways that school meals could be changed that would work with the budget and government provided foods?
So I think what's really important to note is that, barring the issues with inflation and also recognizing some of the supply chain issues that schools are having right now, what I think is really important is one, opportunities where possible, foods that are scratch cooked often can actually be lower cost when whole grain than purchasing a prepackaged refined grain option. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities. And in fact, what we find is that children are more likely to eat foods that are prepared on site than those that are prepackaged as well. So I think really these opportunities for purchasing, whether it's whole grains like the quinoa or like a bulgur for salad, things like that, and preparing on site, that can substantially lower the cost as well. And then also really just emphasizing the USDA commodities as well where possible. That's one of the keys, as many of the food service directors and cafeteria staff here know, for kind of keeping the cost down, and figuring out, well, if the whole grains are slightly higher cost, are there areas where we could potentially lower the cost slightly in other areas with the commodity options available as well.
And then I think we have time for just one more question. Sharon, in your presentation, you briefly mentioned white whole wheat flour. Could you talk more about what that is and maybe, how you like to use it in your kitchen?
Yeah, I saw somebody ask a question. I'm glad they did, because there's a lot of confusion about white whole wheat flour. Some people think it's refined because we call refined flour white flour, but there's actually a variety of wheat that's called white wheat. It's a lighter color. It's a more gentle flavor. It's a little more subtle. It's not quite, it doesn't have so much of that, the tannins in it. So it's much more acceptable. It's more tender. And when you use it in baking, you can hardly tell it's a whole grain flour, but it is. So when you see white whole wheat flour, it is 100% whole grain flour. It's just a different variety of wheat. And I find that it really has a better acceptance, especially in things like baking. I like a little nuttiness in my whole grain bread, but things like cookies and bars where you're looking for a little more delicate texture, you're going to find a lot more acceptance. So I definitely recommend checking out the white whole wheat flour. And I routinely use it at least 50% in any kind of baked, even if it's like a pie. I mean, you just really have good results with it.
Well,
And I'll say personally, I love it. I just, this is not like a promo for them, but I just actually purchased, because if you purchase over a certain amount, it's free shipping. I think I just got like 5 huge things of white whole wheat flour in the mail, because we go through it. That's almost exclusively what I bake with for breads, scones, muffins, really high acceptability among my children and their friends as well.
awesome. Well, thank you both for your time today, for joining us on International Whole Grain Day. And it's a pleasure. So thank you all, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.